In 2019, the government of British Columbia appointed an independent panel consisting of Gary Markle and Al Gorley to create the Old Growth Strategic Review. The panel engaged with First Nations, industry, stakeholders, and communities to gather different perspectives on old growth management. This resulted in over 200 meetings in 45 communities with over 800 participants, over 300 written submissions, 400 published articles and papers, over 1,800 surveys, and 9,000 emails. On April 30th, 2020, the panel submitted their report with 14 recommendations to inform a new approach to old growth management. The government released the report on September 11, 2020, and announced a new holistic approach to protecting old growth forests based on the panel's recommendations. This video goes through the Old Growth Strategic Review that Gary and Al created and the recommendations that the provincial government committed to implement.
Old growth forests are important for many reasons. They provide unique habitats and structures and functions that are not found in younger forests. They're important to people, to First Nations people, to the public, for many reasons, whether it's cultural, aesthetic, recreational, or spiritual. And they're also not easily replaced. It takes 250 years before a forest like this is considered old growth.
I think Al and I share this quite a bit, is that we're not really managing forests. What we do as managers is we translate public expectation into our forests and our lands. And so if the public wants a certain way, that's what our job is as professional managers. And so from our perspective, we certainly had to talk to the industry and all the scientists and all the First Nations and governments and, all that kind of people who are kind of heavily in it. But we also made a point to talk to the much broader sector. We made a point to talk to everybody to really just try to get a pulse on where British Columbia was at. Universally, everybody said we need to change the way we're doing this. This is not right. We don't like the way we're looking after our forests in this province.
When Gary and I were doing our work, we talked about this instability, or in some ways the lack of a clear rudder for forest policy. It tended to move one way when one government would be in power, and then based on lobby groups and pressure, it would move a little bit the other way. And it's very difficult for communities to be certain about their future, at least as certain as you can be. When we looked at that, we thought there's no point in us just addressing ecosystems with big old trees specifically. We have to address this in context of a system that is built on an old paradigm, this paradigm of converting the forest from its natural state to timber farms, and move into a new paradigm where we look at the forest as a very complex biological resource, and we determine how we can utilize it best for humans while maintaining its capacity and its integrity.
The report is really not about old growth. I always say that to people right off the bat. This is not about old growth. This is about the way we look at land and how we manage. But it does turn out, in any mature ecosystem, always has a significant component of old in it. And all those old things contribute to the biodiversity. Turns out that biodiversity is actually the most essential element for maintaining healthy ecosystems. And it's the most essential element in terms of keeping them resilient, in terms of their ability to adapt to changes over time, in terms of their ability to produce ecosystem services that we all depend on, and everything else. There's numerous pieces of literature on the number of things that this maintains. So we made recommendations, all of which are creating an environment within which we have to change our thinking and develop a new paradigm. This paradigm of shifting from managing for resources subject to constraints as priorities to managing for overall holistic health of the land and the ecosystems. That's the underlying shift.
So our recommendations, and we made 14 in total, are broken into groups. There are 5 recommendations that need to be addressed to change the system. First of all, we do this in concert with First Nations and Indigenous people. So it has to be done within the envelope of reconciliation and provincial government working with Indigenous governments. And that will mean that it won't be the same everywhere in the province. There will be different interests, different histories, and different ways of approaching it. But it has to be done together. Secondly, we need to make this shift so that our policies don't look first for what we can take out of the forest, but look first at what does the forest need to sustain itself over time and all its components. In other words, what are the critical biological components that have to be conserved? And that doesn't mean that you can't work in and around them, but they need to be conserved. And having done that, how can we use the forest? So that's the second shift that has to happen, and policy has to be built around that paradigm rather than how much timber can we grow, and in doing that, what do we need to protect? 2 very different things. The third one, and this is essential to making sure that these different ways of doing things get locked in, is a zoning system that we proposed. This is not a new concept, but it's about locking those difficult public choice decisions into the policy on the land, locking it into the plans, and then building the practices around the 3 zones. Again, recognizing that the way these zones would be used will be different across the province because the ecosystems are different across the province. When you're dealing with ancient rainforests on Vancouver Island, it's nowhere near the same as dealing with dry interior pine stands and Kamloops. You will deal with them differently. That's the third fundamental recommendation. The fourth is around governance. That's about who gets to make the decisions and who participates in the decisions. So we've already talked about the Indigenous government, provincial government relationship. But in addition to that, we think stability in the system will come in part from communities and local governments being much more involved in the decision-making processes, and that to do that, they have to be well informed. They have to have access to the scientists, to the good information, and that information has to be interpreted and translated so that they can then make intelligent and meaningful comment on it. So those roles have to be locked in. There have to be processes that are meaningful for those local communities and local groups to participate in the decision making. And then the fifth of those fundamental building blocks, if you like, is good public information. And by good, I mean from a credible source, based on the best available data and scientific information, and understandable by members of the public. And we suggested that that understandable part means somebody needs to take all that information and be able to translate it into language that the average person on the street, the average local government member can understand and then make intelligent decisions around it. So those 5 blocks were very, very important from our perspective, and they're the things that will cause the system to shift. And then building on those 5, a number of specific things that can be done to improve the way we manage old growth forests and ecosystems.
The next set of recommendations are largely about operationalizing the decisions and putting them into place. We need to make sure that while we're making decisions, updating our plans, and changing the system, that we don't lose any of the pieces. The first operational recommendation is focused on deferral areas, where we have systems that have experienced severe depletion in old-growth forests, and they are at risk of being lost if we continue to operate in them. We should defer them temporarily so longer-term decisions can be made. Recommendation 7 is a focus on compliance with existing requirements. Where we have rules in place to protect the biological diversity and they're not being fully followed, we should bring our activities into compliance with the requirements and follow them. There's been a reasonable amount of compliance and enforcement to make sure the rules are being followed, but not a lot of monitoring and assessment to determine whether they're working or whether they're achieving the things we want in the big scheme of things. So this recommendation focuses on a much more robust monitoring system. Setting and managing objectives and targets focuses on establishing a standardized system and guidance that integrates provincial goals and priorities to local objectives and targets. While it is recognized in the report that a whole range of values arise from old forests, it is the biological values that are paramount. So while there are a lot of guidelines in place, they are in some cases outdated and they should be brought current. After that, we need to identify areas where we're going to need better information. We're going to need new guidelines around what constitutes protection of old forests and what needs to be protected. And we're going to need the systems that make the plans operational. The final operational recommendation was focused on innovation around silviculture practices, and that includes how we log and how we reestablish forests after logging. You can still derive wealth from the forest, but you can do it in a way that protects the biological resources. Some silviculture systems do that better than others. There are two transitional recommendations. The first focuses on having an implementation plan and strategy that is jointly developed by the provincial government and indigenous governments while involving First Nations, the public, and stakeholders to define, monitor, and schedule the process. Although implementation may not look the same in all areas due to differences in ecological factors and interests, it is important to make the right shifts for local needs. The last recommendation is focused on planning for change within communities as much as possible. The focus is on mitigating the negative consequences to social and economic stability while making changes to better protect ecosystems and biological resources.
It's not quick work, but when it's done properly, it's lasting work. But it takes time, and I think our measure now is that many people are getting that, and they're really focusing on what do we do to foster long-term real change as opposed to these kind of magic bullet changes. So that's why I also am optimistic. The thing is, when you're fostering long-term change like this, it's hard to see the progress sometimes. And so you really have to dig out the successes and the progress, and you have to celebrate it.
The acceptance of the report by the British Columbia government is a launching point for developing actions that can be implemented. There is clear support from the provincial government for all 14 of the recommendations. The next steps include developing a comprehensive action plan and a BC biodiversity and ecosystem health framework in collaboration with Indigenous governments and other leaders and organizations.